Artificial intelligence regulation is everywhere. New laws appear. New guidelines are announced. New ethical frameworks are published. New public debates dominate headlines. Conferences are held. Panels are convened. White papers circulate. Press releases promise responsibility. From the outside, it looks like artificial intelligence is being actively governed. The volume of regulation suggests control. The language suggests oversight. The process suggests accountability. But beneath this surface, something else is happening. The systems that shape strategic outcomes remain untouched. Not delayed, not restrained, not redirected, untouched. This is not a failure of policy design. It is a feature of how regulation is constructed. Most AI regulation is designed to target visibility. Consumer products, public platforms, commercial applications, interfaces people can see, use, and complain about. These systems are easy to identify, easy to audit, easy to debate. They generate measurable harm. They create visible controversy. They fit legislative frameworks. But they are not where decisive power resides. They are not where national advantage is produced. They are not where strategic leverage is accumulated. They are not where long-term outcomes are shaped. The systems that matter most operate elsewhere, inside classified environments, within national security exemptions, embedded deeply in institutional infrastructure. They do not appear in app stores. They do not interact with consumers. They do not require public consent. These systems are not violated by law. They are shielded by it. Regulation begins with jurisdiction, and jurisdiction ends where classification begins. Once an AI system is labeled critical to national security, it exits civilian regulatory space. Not temporarily, permanently. Oversight transfers internally. Civilian regulators step aside. Security authorities assume control. Transparency dissolves. Reporting becomes restricted. Documentation becomes classified. Disclosure becomes optional. Public accountability stops. This legal boundary is not accidental. It is foundational. It allows governments to comply publicly while operating privately. Outward compliance. Inward exemption. Laws apply outward. They govern markets. They govern consumers. They govern public-facing systems. Exemptions apply inward. They govern intelligence. They govern defense. They govern strategic infrastructure. Regulation governs the visible layer. Power operates in the hidden layer. This separation is not a loophole. It is the architecture of modern governance. A second barrier is definitional. Regulations define artificial intelligence narrowly. Models, algorithms, discrete applications. Identifiable systems with names and interfaces. But strategic AI is not deployed that way. It is not a single model. It is not a single algorithm. It is an integrated architecture. Pipelines that ingest data continuously. Systems that fuse human judgment with machine output. Decision loops that adapt in real time. By regulating components, law misses systems. By auditing parts, it ignores wholes. Strategic AI is rarely deployed as a product. It is deployed as capability. Capabilities do not announce themselves. They evolve quietly. They migrate across platforms. They integrate into existing workflows. They disappear into infrastructure. Capabilities are difficult to regulate because they are diffuse. There is no single object to inspect, no single deployment to license, no single rule that captures their function. They exist across institutions, not within them. The third obstacle is institutional incentives. Regulators depend on information provided by the institutions they oversee. This dependency is manageable in civilian contexts. It becomes structural in classified environments. In these contexts, disclosure is limited by design. Oversight bodies receive summaries, curated briefings, high-level descriptions, risk assessments prepared internally. They do not receive systems. They do not receive source code. They do not observe live operations. They receive intent, not execution. This asymmetry is permanent. Regulators cannot regulate what they cannot see, and they cannot compel visibility without violating classification frameworks that protect the system itself. The result is regulatory deference disguised as oversight. Hearings are held, reports are written, findings are summarized, but the underlying systems remain unchanged. Public AI regulation also operates through ethical frames: bias, fairness, explainability, transparency, accountability. These concerns are meaningful in visible systems. They matter when AI affects hiring decisions, when it influences credit scoring, when it moderates content or allocates healthcare. They protect individuals. They shape consumer trust. They are largely irrelevant for strategic AI. Strategic systems are evaluated differently: by effectiveness, by accuracy, by resilience. By strategic advantage, ethics becomes conditional. Compliance is internal. Outcomes matter more than explanation. This creates a bifurcation: one AI ecosystem optimized for compliance, another optimized for capability. The compliant ecosystem absorbs regulatory attention. The capability ecosystem advances quietly. Regulation strengthens the first and ignores the second. Timing further undermines regulatory impact. Regulatory processes are slow by design. They require consultation, review, negotiation, compromise. Strategic AI development is continuous. It does not wait for approval cycles. Models update. Architectures evolve. Data pipelines expand. By the time rules are drafted, systems have already changed. By the time laws pass, capabilities have moved on. Regulation chases shadows. International coordination compounds the problem. AI regulation varies across jurisdictions. Standards diverge. Definitions conflict. Enforcement thresholds differ. Strategic systems exploit this fragmentation. Development shifts geographically. Partnerships reorganize. Data flows reroute. Jurisdiction shopping becomes standard. When constraints appear in one region, capability migrates to another. Even when international accords exist, enforcement remains weak. Verification requires access. Access requires consent. Consent conflicts with secrecy. Agreements regulate stated intentions. They do not regulate live operations. They promise alignment. They do not enforce restraint. Another layer reinforces this structure. Regulatory theater. Public regulation signals action. It reassures citizens. It satisfies political demand. It generates headlines. Committees announce progress. Leaders promise safeguards. Institutions publish frameworks. Meanwhile, real systems continue under separate authority. Compliance becomes performative. Power remains unaffected. This theater benefits institutions. It absorbs scrutiny. It channels debate into manageable spaces. It protects strategic systems from exposure. Corporate actors participate in this dynamic. Publicly, they advocate regulation. They endorse ethical principles. They fund research on safety. They publish transparency reports. Privately, they navigate exemptions. Dual-use technologies fall under security frameworks. Corporate infrastructure integrates with state systems quietly. Cloud capacity is shared. Data access expands. Capabilities converge. This convergence further insulates strategic AI. Regulation that constrains corporations publicly often strengthens state-corporate alignment privately. The system becomes more integrated, more resilient to oversight. In earlier briefings, we examined who controls artificial intelligence. We mapped the governance networks that exercise that control. This analysis explains why regulation never reaches them, because regulation governs behavior, control governs architecture, and architecture determines outcomes. As long as AI power is embedded in infrastructure, funding, data access, and deployment authority, regulation aimed at interfaces will remain irrelevant. The gap between regulation and reality is widening. Public debates intensify. Laws multiply. Ethical frameworks expand. Strategic systems accelerate. This divergence is not accidental. It reflects where power prefers to operate. Away from visibility, away from debate, away from consent. Understanding this is essential, not to dismiss regulation, but to recognize its limits, because systems change only when incentives change. And in strategic AI, incentives favor opacity. Analysis complete. In the next restricted briefing, we will examine how algorithmic systems shape global policy decisions before lawmakers ever intervene. Subscribe to Dark Power, Index to access the next restricted briefing file. Access the data.